right. Well, we will go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And on behalf of the Prescription Playbook, I also want to thank you for joining us today to learn about the effects stimulants can have on adolescents. My name is Courtney, and my colleague and I, Abby Lee, will be your moderators for today's event. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to submit questions into the chat box, and at the end, we will take the time to address as many of those as we can. So I also want to take a moment to welcome Dr. Erin Weiner as our guest speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Weiner is a board-certified psychologist and addiction specialist and speaks nationally on the topics of addiction, behavioral health, and the impact of drug policy on public health. He earned his doctorate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and completed his fellowship in addiction psychology at the VA Ann Arbor healthcare system. His perspective is informed by years of experiencing growing and directing addiction service lines for hospitals and healthcare systems, the current state of medical and psychological research, and his own observations in private practice. Dr. Weiner is the president-elect of the Society of Addiction Psychology, a member of the Physician Speakers Bureau for the National Safety Council, and on the Science Advisory Board for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to Dr. Weiner.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Let me just click a couple times and share my screen. There we go. So our topic today is we are going to examine the effects of stimulants, and in particular prescription stimulants, on adolescents. And this is a topic we were actually talking before the presentation that honestly, I was very thankful for the opportunity to go back into the research and refresh myself on, because this is an area that is growing in importance and that we don't, in my opinion, pay quite enough attention to. And so my hope for you guys today is that you will find that there's things not only that you learn and that you take away from it in that regard, but also that you can act on. I'm a big fan of learning for a purpose and feeling like you can take it and then actually go out and put it into action. So if you have any questions today, we should have some time at the end for questions, and I'm happy to stick around a few minutes afterwards to do that, if you're able to do so as well. But if we can't or you can't, my email is there in the bottom left of this slide, Erin@weinerphd.com. Please feel free to reach out to me in email now or later, and it'll be on the last slide of the presentation as well. So that being said, let's dive in. First, looking at more a broad view of what's going on with youth substance use, because this is an area that's very important because of the implications over really the whole lifespan. But essentially, by their senior year, what we know from national level data is that 70% of seniors have tried alcohol, 40% have either vaped nicotine or have smoked a cigarette. About 1 in 3 will have used marijuana or tried THC products. And about 1 in 5 will have misused a prescription. And of that 1 in 5, about 16% of that total of 20 are for stimulants. So when we're talking about misuse of prescription stimulants, that's about 1 out of 6. Quick reminder, please mute your mics. Otherwise, hosts, you have full mic clearance to go and humiliate people by name when you mute them. I'm joking, we probably won't humiliate people, but please check your mics and please turn them off. But 1 in 6 kids right now will have misused a prescription stimulant in particular. One of the big action items here, in my opinion, however, is that when you look at polls of students, about 42% of them believe that many of their peers use them, which is very different than 16%. That implies at least over half. And so, like many of these statistics, actually, my hunch is that if we pulled the data for, say, marijuana and THC products, we'd see that same trend where people think that everybody's vaping. People think that everyone's using pot, but that's really not the case. We call those descriptive norms, when it seems like what you think about your community is different from the reality. But then that perception of everyone thinks that it's okay to do this, many people are doing this, then creates a permission structure for yourself to go out and do it as well. So there's a misperception there between what's actually going on and what kids think is going on. But ultimately, all this drives into the fact that 8% of the general population has a diagnosable substance use disorder for stimulants or otherwise, 90% of which start during their teenage years. And that's part of why you have prevention coalitions and groups and nonprofits like Omni that are focusing on youth, because if you can shepherd young people out of their teenage years without getting involved at all, or particularly involved in substances, chances are pretty good that this won't be an issue for them for the rest of their life. And that's why we focus so much on youth. Young adulthood is another really critical area. Your 18 to 25-year-olds, it all definitely matters. But young people in particular, we want to try to get them through that without them falling into that particular trap. Now, that being said, today, as I mentioned, we are going to focus primarily on prescription stimulants. And so when we talk about those, we're talking about two main categories. Dextroamphetamines or amphetamines, which are Adderall, Dexedrine, and Vyvanse, are the brand names that you might have heard of, or your methylphenidates, which is the core of Ritalin and Concerta. These, I think this is a bullet a little further on, is that they're primarily prescribed for ADHD and then also narcolepsy, although you're not seeing too many stimulant prescriptions for narcolepsy in teenagers. ADHD, though, is another story, and we'll get to those numbers in a second. The effects of these, though, are that essentially their main mechanism of action is through dopamine. ADHD is essentially due to a dopamine imbalance and a dopamine deficit in the brain. There are, again, some other neurotransmitters involved, but dopamine is the main one. And so by increasing that dopamine level, you can correct that imbalance and potentially resolve some of those symptoms of ADHD. So what the effects are: increased attention, concentration, and alertness. It also can increase blood pressure and heart rate. And this mechanism works both for anybody, kids or adults who have ADHD, but then also those who don't. Now, paradoxically, and we'll talk more about this in a second, it doesn't seem to actually improve people's grades if they don't have ADHD, and we'll talk about why in a second. But the mechanism of action and what it's doing in the brain is the same for everybody, whether or not you have ADHD or not. So as I mentioned, stimulants are often appropriate for the treatment of ADHD, and it's worth mentioning that particularly for young people, they shouldn't be a first line. We could talk for quite a bit about like what are the evidence-based treatments for ADHD and what sequence should they be done in. But actually, parental training and behavioral modification methods are far and away what people should be doing, ideally from a fairly early age, because there's a lot of behavioral shaping that can go on. Chemicals aside, it's definitely an uphill battle if there is that imbalance, but the impact of introducing a chemical into the brain is increased the earlier you do it. So ideally, the longer you can wait to put a child onto stimulants, the better for their health it's going to be overall, even if they benefit a lot from that, and even if they're on it for quite some time. I don't have this statistic in the presentation, but there is a very significant amount of young people who are diagnosed with ADHD where they don't just quote unquote age out of it. I think it's somewhere along the lines of about 75% of people who are diagnosed with ADHD during childhood have at least some symptoms when they're an adult. We do tend to find that it ameliorates a bit, it gets better, but it's not like it entirely goes away. And so some people might get a lot of benefit out of stimulants for that reason for a very long time. Right now, about 1 out of 10 kids in the United States are diagnosed with ADHD. And this is a number that's been going up over time. This is the most recent data I could find. It was actually published, I believe, in 2019, where you can see here that the overall percentage has been going up and up and up to that 10%, which is, again, the last number we have in 2015 to 2016. The ratio is 4 to 1 boys to girls, and the consensus concern amongst people who focus on ADHD for their research is that the concern there is that that might mean that there's a bit of overdiagnosis with boys and a bit of underdiagnosis with girls, in part because there's a natural tendency for boys to have more of those hyperactive and inattentive features anyway. So that might not actually be clinical, though. It might just be the developmental curve. There's also some concern that it is overdiagnosed, where you might have a child who's just struggling to regulate for other reasons, or maybe they're having they've gone through some adverse childhood event, and or multiple for that matter, and are having self-regulation issues, and they're being misdiagnosed. But for better or for worse, right now that number sits at about 10%. And of those kids, which is a very significant amount right now, 62% overall do receive medication, which is a very significant amount. However, and this is where you've got this really delicate balance, 43% of teens with a prescription also use it non-medically. So there's what they're supposed to be doing with it, from what's on the prescription pill bottle, and then there's what they're actually doing with it. And 43% is actually pretty high. That's 2 and 5. Eking your way up to 1 and 2, 50%. That's a lot of kids. And so this is a very complicated balance for both parents and for physicians in terms of the prescribing side, where if you know that 2 out of every 5 kids you're prescribing it to is going to be misusing it in some way, that's a very significant amount. And so if you're obviously the physician isn't in a place to help put some guardrails on for that. That's more on the parent side of things, and on the educator and preventionist side of things, as we might be on this webinar today. But it does create a difficult web. Now, in terms of risk factors for stimulant misuse, as what that should say there at the top, or non-medical use, males tend to do this more than females. So what we're going to look at over these next few slides, this was a recent study that looked at the odds of if they're going to use non-medically, and if it's to the right of that line, that means there's a greater odds, and to the left, it's less. Some trends I want to point out here: males do tend to do this more than females. This study was a meta-analysis of a number of different studies that put them all together. That's why you can see there that age is positively correlated with greater odds, including as people age up. Caucasian or white individuals tend to do this more than actually all the minorities that were studied. The region we'll skip past. I'm not sure if there's too much validity to that, but it does seem that in the central and south regions versus the west, we were seeing more. For school-age kids, though, this age bias, where kids as they get older tend to do this more, is borne out. So you can see here that the 10th and 12th grade odds as opposed to 8th are up, or being in the 3rd year of school versus the 1st, if it was measured in that way for the study. Kids who have plans who have no plans for college tend to actually do it more than kids who do have plans for college. Kids who have higher grades are tending to do it less. So if you have a grade of B or a grade of C or D versus a grade of A, you're more likely to do it. And then again, if your grade point average is lower, your tendency to do this is higher. So again, pressing on this idea of I'm going to use these to try to raise my grades. The ADHD symptom count is also positively correlated with this. So the more symptoms of ADHD a young person has, the more likely they're going to misuse it. Whether or not they have that medication, you can see the highest, where the dot is showing the midpoint of that odds ratio, and then the bar that extends left and right is the confidence interval based on how many studies we're looking at it. So you can see some of the furthest dots to the right have to do with whether or not they have ADHD medication in the first place. If you draw your eye down a little bit more here, you can see that substance use and then binge alcohol use is pretty high, and then particularly here marijuana use. And we're not going to go too far into marijuana today, but that is a trend that we're seeing, is that young people who are using THC products tend to be more likely to misuse other products as well. You can see the motivations here in terms of studying better, staying awake, and losing weight. Here's those ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences I was mentioning before. You'll notice down there at the bottom left, actually, a couple protective factors are having strong student-teacher relationships, as well as having 2 biological parents in the child's life. And then notably, actually, the school district size is a predictor of use in a negative direction, so more likely to misuse it. I'm not really sure if we can do much about that if we're in a large district, but it's something worth noting. So in terms of why do teens misuse stimulants, we touched on it a little bit from that one study, but when you look at them more broadly, there's a couple main reasons why. One is performance enhancement, and the other, the picture down there, is about socializing. We'll talk more about that, or social pressure. So in terms of performance enhancement, the punchline here, I actually kind of said it at the beginning, is that it's not actually true. What we see over and over and over and over, there's actually a lot of studies that show this, is that if you do not have ADHD, it's actually negatively correlated with academic functioning across a number of different studies. It actually seems like the more stimulants people are using when they don't have ADHD, the lower their GPA ends up being in both high school and college. And the reason for this is that while it actually does, and this is for individuals without ADHD, it does lead to mild increases in focus and energy, but significant losses in memory. And part of the reason for this is that you can imagine the dopamine to concentration and abilities as kind of like an upside down U, so kind of like a upside down parabolic function, where if you are on the lower end of the dopamine curve, when this is added in, it brings you up to the top of that curve, so you're at peak functioning. But if you're already at the right place on that curve, if you're at the top, it's going to push you over the top and bring you back down on the far side of that curve. So again, that upside down parabola. And so although in terms of the focus and energy that might be there, but if you can't remember what you're doing, or if it actually disrupts you in other ways, it's not going to help you. And that's part of why we do see dramatic improvements for kids who actually have ADHD who take this medication. But for those that don't, but placebos are a very powerful thing. Desperation also drives a lot of behavior. And so you might see these kids thinking, I need to do this in order to achieve, or I've got to get a competitive edge. It's not actually the thing that's giving them the competitive edge. They actually have those capabilities inside of them anyway. If anything, the stimulants are actually just holding them back. Despite that, though, there is a tremendous amount of peer pressure that goes on with all sorts of substances when you are in high school, and stimulants can be part of that as well. There's a desire when you're in high school to build your own identity and also connection to others. And so if you're in a peer group where others are using stimulants, if you're the only one not doing that, that puts you on the outside, and that seems very threatening. The same thing is true if you're trying to fit in with a new group of people. If you've either, say, moved school districts, or you're trying to make new friends and they all seem to be doing something, if you're the only one who's not, that puts you on the outside. And that's a very hard place to be when you're trying to figure out who you are and who you connect to. And the other main reason that we're seeing in studies for kids using is to escape from problems and to cope with their problems. And actually, what we see in studies on stimulants in particular is that kids, when they're younger, tend to be using it more for the latter two, around peer acceptance and to cope with their problems, versus academic achievement. And actually, in college is when you start to see kids more often use stimulants to try to boost their grades. Again, the data doesn't bear this out, but that's what they're trying to do. Now, this last point about trying to create a sense of euphoria or escape from problems is particularly salient right now. It's really important right now because the pandemic has created a huge problem with youth mental health. And you've probably seen something about this on the news. It's been getting more traction of late, which is a very important thing because we've got to be proactive about this. But a few studies I want to highlight. This one found that from University of Michigan, medicine, and Minnesota medicine found that 46% of parents reported a new or worsening problem in their child over the course of the pandemic, more so for teen girls than teen boys. Anxiety was the most common, depression, sleep issues were right behind that. This led to an increase in health insurance claims. But there have been 2 studies published in the last 6 weeks that were very jarring for me, and I want to make sure that we're all thinking about as well. This one was released by the CDC, looking at depressive symptoms, and they found some really striking, shocking results down there at the bottom, that 44% of high schoolers said that they experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness over the past 2 years. And 1 in 5 kids reported seriously considered attempting suicide, which is a mind-bogglingly high amount. 1 in 5, like that's but that's real. That's from the CDC. What they were finding as well is that this was driven by a sense of disconnection. So what you're looking at in those boxes there at the top are, if we go to the left one here, the dark blue line are kids who agreed or strongly agreed that they felt close to other kids, other persons at school. And you can see that the percentage of kids endorsing those variables down the middle was less the more connected they felt. And this actually was true as well for kids who felt virtually connected to others, although the effect wasn't quite as strong. But the isolation was a huge problem and a huge deal for the kids over the course of school shutdowns and just lockdowns in general over the course of the pandemic. There was another study that came out that was a meta-analysis again, so putting a bunch of studies together, looking at the global prevalence of depressive and anxiety symptoms during COVID for children and adolescents. And what they found here, I just want to highlight their anxiety results, was that 20% of kids had clinical levels of anxiety. And this is 2 times higher than pre-pandemic levels. So the rate of clinical anxiety doubled, and it's been worsening over time. So this study just came out a couple months ago. So they analyzed data up through 2021. And you can see if you look at the dates of these studies and then over time and the prevalence rate of anxiety, you can clearly see that the prevalence rate is going up and up and up and up as we go further and further and further in the publication date. So this is a trend that continues to get worse. We have to pay attention to this. I'll just put it bluntly. As this gets worse, this is going to have a ripple effect that's going to go on for years, if not decades. And it's also then going to trickle down into coping behaviors. So to give you a couple examples, we've seen alcohol beverage sales go up by about 50% overall in this pandemic, with a huge portion of that coming from online sales. We've seen cannabis sales do the same thing. They're up about 30 to 40% over the course of the pandemic. You probably recently saw that the 2021 numbers were released for drug overdoses and that they continue to go up. We've got 107,000 drug overdoses, largely driven by fentanyl in this country, the highest yet on record. This huge steep increase here is the pandemic right there at the edge. And there was a study also just released in the last month, and this is just extremely disturbing to look at. These are adolescent overdose deaths. And look at what's happened here from 2019 to 2021. This is fentanyl. That's over a 200% increase between 2019 and 2021 for fentanyl, because fentanyl is getting into everything, including into what young people, this is again, adolescents, 18 and under, or I'm sorry, 17 and under, where we're seeing this massive spike. Everything, if you look at it, for the most part, is actually going up. Benzos as well. Looks like heroin's actually the only one that's going down, maybe a little bit of cocaine. But why this is happening, and this is also driving into eating disorders, which we've seen go up, self-harm, all these trends, is because kids are trying to figure out how to cope with this additional stressor. With these additional stressors. And when they don't know what to do, they tend to go towards what feels like quick fixes. And that's because the way our brain works is that we've got two different sides to our brain, which I think is best embodied. This is the best representation I have of the human brain. It's of a dog driving a Tesla. And why I like this picture, one, that it's cute, but also that it's got the 2 main parts of our brain, the thinking side and the feeling side. The thinking side, which is largely in our prefrontal cortex, that's where we have all of these really advanced functions. It's what separates us in many ways from animals. It's our ability to reason, to think into the future, to plan, to task switch, to motivate ourselves, to do all of these higher order functions that are essential for success in school and, generally speaking, in our society. However, even as advanced as it is much weaker than our old brain, than our more primal brain, which is our thinking, which is not our thinking brain, it is our feeling brain. That's our limbic system. That's the part of our brain that its primary goals are to enhance pleasure, but then also, and this one is even more important, to avoid pain and discomfort. And so what happens when we're feeling uncomfortable is the dog in our brain takes the wheel and is like, oh, we don't want to feel that way. So how do we stop this right now? And the thing about kids is your prefrontal cortex is the last thing to develop. It's actually not fully done cooking until you're about 25. It's the last thing to develop. That's why renting a car, you can't do that till you're 25, because renting a car is the most important thing to wait on. I don't know, and go figure. But anyway, it is the last thing to develop. And so that means that they have even fewer resources to try to control or try to shape that dog's behavior. So when you get uncomfortable, they want to fix it right now. That's why I don't know if you guys have heard of the marshmallow test. It's not necessarily predictive of all the things it was supposed to be predictive of, but it's a really good example of how this works. If you haven't heard of this, this was a test where you took a child, you put him in front of 2 marshmallows and say, you can either eat these marshmallows now, or if you wait in 10 minutes, I will give you 20 more marshmallows. And so this highlights a behavioral concept that actually applies to all of us, which is that we tend to discount things that we have to wait for. We call it temporal discounting or delayed discounting. We tend to want to feel better right now. And it's because this little dog is like, right now, I'm feeling bad. Or right now, I want to feel better. And it's in all of us. That's why if you're feeling stressed out, you think to yourself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go grab a whole bowl of chocolate chips and eat it right before I go to bed. Not that I have any experience with that whatsoever, but that's the dog taking the wheel, right? Saying, you know what I'd like to do? Feel good right now. Or when you've got a lot of work to do, but you're like, you know what? I'm going to go binge watch something on Hulu instead because that feels good and it's going to make me forget about what I really need to do. That's 2 marshmallow thinking, if you will, as opposed to 20 marshmallow thinking. Part of that is, though, that, and why it's so hard to shape the brain, I think I got a slide on this later, is that this little guy, he doesn't speak English. Like dogs, it truly is like the dog part of our mind. Dogs don't actually speak English, right? When they learn sit, it's not that they actually understand the concept of sit. They've just linked those phonemes with a certain behavior, and then they get rewarded for it. That's why they do it. You reward them for listening to you. Our brain works the same way. So when you try to say, like, reason your way out of anxiety, like talk yourself down off of feeling really anxious, or if you're, like, say, getting in an argument with your significant other, a lot of times, like it's hard to reason or to have empathy. It's because what's going on right there is you're just in the state of discomfort. You want to be seen, or you want to stop being hurt by the other person. And so you're just going to lash out, or you're going to turtle up and hide. You're going to do what you need to do to feel better in that moment. And that's because the dog doesn't work with rationality. And so when you're talking about a whole cohort of kids right now who are constantly being stressed out, you're going to see them move more towards these behaviors. And that the point I really want to underscore is that behavior is purpose-driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. And so this goes with stimulant use, any other drug use, eating disorders, all these sorts of maladaptive coping strategies. As a parent or as a caring adult, you might look at that and say, why are they doing it? Or even like they're having a consequence, like they're having a consequence at school, or they're struggling with their parents, or even they're having a legal consequence. Why are they coming back to it? There's a reason. There's actually a very important reason if people are continuing that behavior, even if there's consequences, because again, there's a dog driving that car. And so if they're still making the judgment that the reward of that activity means more to them than the consequence they're getting, there must be a really powerful reward. And that's why, and we'll talk more about this in the end of the presentation, if we're trying to intervene effectively, we need to make them a better offer. There's a problem they're trying to solve with their behavior. They're trying to get themselves to a better place. And unless we understand what that is and give them another way to meet those needs, you're not necessarily going to be able to punish or consequence a child out of a maladaptive behavior, because for them, it's actually doing something positive, again, something very positive to outweigh the consequence. So coming back to stimulants for a second, where are these pills coming from? The main answer to this is actually prescription diversion. There was a study that looked at this in depth. I've got some pictures in a second, but the most common source where kids get these are from friends and family given for free. One study looking at these adolescents found that 26%, so 1 in 4, admitted diverting their methylphenidate in the past month. Probably the same thing holds true for the dextroamphetamines like Adderall. But the teens who are more likely to divert, and this is again from research, are older teens with the prescriptions, ones who are open to others about having ADHD and having a prescription in the first place, ones who are more tolerant of drug misuse in the first place, ones who are around more favorable peer norms for this behavior. So if you're hanging out with a group of kids who doesn't see a problem in using drugs, you are more likely than to do it yourself. There was one interesting study that looked at physician perspectives, and actually about 2 in 5 physicians thinks that it's very either common or very common for high school students to divert. And they actually found that 75% of physicians feel that one or more of their patients in the past 12 months feigned symptoms to get a prescription in the first place. And that leads to this graph, again, a study I thought was very interesting, looking at where people are getting their stimulants. And so what these are is this light gray is people with use disorder. So basically people who identify as having an addiction. The general population is the middle bar, and then students in particular are the one on the right. And you can see here that students, their friend or family for free bar is the highest of all of them. The second highest is from a legitimate medical source. So that's, again, that 42% of kids who misuse stimulants are misusing their own. So they're not having an attentional problem, but they're just using more than they need to. Theft is also a big one. And then for students as well, you'll see the dealer or street market is fairly low, actually, compared to others. So again, the main two sources there, if you look at them, are from the friend or family for free and a legitimate medical source. It adds up to more than 100% because a lot of people get them from more than one place. What was also interesting to see was that this looks very different for different prescription medications that are being misused. So in this graph, the stimulants are the darkest line. Opioids are on the left, and then sedatives, these would be things like Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, Valium are in the middle. And again, you can see here that far and away, people are getting their stimulants for free from friend or family versus other drug types. So that's where they're coming from. It's not generally speaking, it's not off the street. An illegitimate medical source are things like when you're feigning your symptoms, like I mentioned in that previous study, or if you're doctor shopping and going from one doctor to another and trying to compile prescriptions that way. So why does this matter? Well, there's a negative impact of stimulant misuse on adolescents. So during your teenage years, if you are using stimulants, the research shows that you have an increased chance to then use other drugs. Part of this is due to social exposure. So when you are around, when you're around people who are misusing some drugs, there's a much greater chance you're going to see other drugs for you to misuse recreationally. It's just what's there. There's also changes in perceived risk. And this is really important because when you start using substances, it's easier then for you to justify yourself using other ones because you don't think it's as risky of a behavior. So part of what I mean by this, this was just a very striking graph. The data is a little bit old, but it holds true to the present. I just haven't seen as pretty of a graph that shows this, is that if you look at the use rates for kids 12 to 17 for past month binge drinking by risk, how risky they think the behavior is, you can see that those who perceive a great risk are half as likely to binge drink in the last month than those who don't. And it's even more pronounced for something like marijuana. If they think there's a great risk to smoking marijuana, they're 15 times less likely to do it than if they don't think that there's a great risk in doing it. So it starts to change whether or not they think that that behavior and other drugs are as risky, ultimately leading to this identity shift. I am someone who gets high for fun. I hang out with other people who get high for fun. I'm willing to use drugs to achieve whatever goals I'm trying to achieve, whether or not it's social anxiety, depression reduction, social acceptance. You start to think like this is something that I do. And once you start breaking the ice on that, or even I obtain drugs illegally to use them, it's a lot less of a jump then to do something like, say, heroin, right? Where you're more likely to encounter that fentanyl. Just to give you an example, like nobody actually starts their drug journey at heroin or fentanyl, right? That's not how people start using, because the perceived risk of that is too high. And if you see yourself as a rule follower, you're probably not going to just on a whim go tie off your arm and inject heroin, right? That's not the way that works. You've got to break down some walls, go through some steps in the meantime. Your identity has to shift over time. There are also an increased chance of developing other mental health disorders, in particular anxiety is a big one for this, because stimulants actually, for those who don't have ADHD, again, they start going down the far side of that N-shaped, that inverse parabola, and that actually makes them more anxious. And it also can make it so that if they're getting high off of these, they're not dealing with their problems in other ways, they're dealing with them through drugs. And that means that they don't have as many internal resources to be able to deal with these things. It also actually disrupts brain development. And we don't have, unfortunately, I was really combing through PubMed trying to find some new studies about this. There's a very well-documented link between stimulant use and altered brain development in rodent models. There's a lot of research about it there. We don't have as many fMRI studies on humans right now to really be able to draw a conclusion. If you're interested in this data, email me and I'll send you what I have. But right now, what I can say is that there's a very good chance that at some point in the future we'll nail this down for sure, but there's also a very good chance that it does impact both the structure and the functioning of the brain if you're misusing stimulants, again, overusing, so not having the normal balance of dopamine in the brain, but having an imbalance of dopamine in the brain in a positive direction from stimulants on your brain development. It also potentially can lead to legal issues, and that's something, I don't think I have the statistic in here, but I think it was only 3% of kids who misuse stimulants even really have a concern about it being illegal or that diverting it is illegal, which is kind of bizarrely low because it actually is illegal to do that, to both share prescription medication or to use someone else's prescription medication. During adulthood, what we know as well is that people who misuse stimulants during adolescence are more likely to have an addiction, and that goes along with all the other data we've seen. And that they're more likely to have lower educational attainment, which again, I think is counterintuitive for kids who think, oh, like I'm going to use these to focus better and achieve more. We don't see that overall. They might actually just be causing themselves more barriers and be achieving despite the stimulant use, not because of it. So that leads to the question of how can we help, which is a really important part of this puzzle. That's the landscape. It's out there. Kids are using it right now. That number sits at 1 in 6 by their senior year have tried this. So what can we do about this? The first thing you could do is know what to look for. So possible signs of use that you're going to see in a school environment are things like being truant, missing assignments, dropping grades, being distracted in class, asking to use the bathroom often, or going to bathrooms or areas of school not by their classes. That one's particularly also for vaping. You might notice notable changes in behavior or wakefulness at different times of the day. So if it seems like a young person, a student, they're coming into school and they're very fatigued, and then they're very alert and even maybe hyperactive in a way in the second part of the day, that could be an indication that they took a stimulant even while they were at school. Specific stimulant specific signs of things to look for stimulants in particular is irritability, rapid speech, and difficulty concentrating, again, because misuse creates that, as opposed to if you actually have ADHD and are leveling yourself, where you then can concentrate better. High body temperature and sweating, increased heart rate, high anxiety at very high levels, even potentially seizures and vomiting and tremors. Essentially, again, a stimulant ups your sympathetic and autonomic nervous system. So it kicks it into a higher gear. So you're going to see the blood pressure go up, the heart rate go up, the agitation, the edginess go up, and everything that goes along with that. So as someone who works with young people, the most important thing that you can do is create emotional safety so that someone will disclose to you, and then also potentially accept your guidance. And there's an acronym that I think is fantastic for this called Communicate with Love. I did not make this up, so I don't want to take credit for it, but it's a great way of framing communication skills that will make it more likely for a young person to open up to you because they feel safe with you, and then also for them to take your advice. And that stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So the L of love is listening, and two things to think about when you're listening are to use open-ended questions and reflections. So all this goes into the concept of active listening, which is that you can't take on faith that someone knows you're listening to them. You actually have to show them that you're listening to them, and you can do that in several different ways. One is open-ended questions, and these are questions that show that you're actually interested in hearing more about what the person has to say, because you ask your question in a way that opens up for details, hence open-ended. So questions like this start with words like what or why or I'm interested, tell me more about, and then finish the stem. So like if you were to ask, what's the most interesting thing going on in your life right now, you're going to get a much more elaborative answer than saying, or even how are things going. Although that one you can maybe hear like a fine in response to that. Whereas what's the most interesting thing or what's the most challenging thing would get a longer result than if you were just asking a more directive yes or no sort of question. Even asking the question shows that you care, which is received sometimes more consciously than not. Reflections also show that you're listening, because what you do when you reflect is you take in the information, which can either be about the content or the underlying emotion of what someone is telling you, and you reflect it back to them, ideally in different words. So if you have a student who's telling you that they studied really hard for their geometry test, but they just can't seem to get a good grade, if you say back to them, oh man, that sounds so frustrating, putting all that effort in and not getting out what you think you should. What that does is it, one, shows that you're seeing them, you're seeing their feelings, because you named their emotion, you're frustrated, and you reflected back what they said to you in different words, which again shows that you're intaking it and you're really listening. Hashtag therapist tricks, by the way. For those of you who might be providers of mental health on the webinar, will also probably recognize a lot of what we're talking about here as motivational interviewing, which is a great way of creating that safe space and then prompting action. So the O stands for offering. More specifically, how do you offer guidance and advice so that someone is more likely to take it? And the best way to do this is through what we call a feedback sandwich, where the feedback or the guidance is sandwiched between two prompts for the other person to consent or to give their own opinion. So the first slice of bread, if you will, is you actually ask permission to give guidance or advice. So if you're in a conversation and you see an ability to, or an opening to give some guidance, first say, hey, do you mind if I share some thoughts with you? Or I've been through something like this. Do you mind if I tell you what I'm thinking? Doing that means that they are literally asking for what you have to say, which means that you're not pushing it on them. One of the most common dynamics between parents and kids or authority figures, students, is if you push, they can push back. So you can diffuse that by asking. And then they say yes, and then you say that, then they've literally asked for it. So then you provide the information, then afterwards, you ask them for their reaction. You can even say, it's totally okay to disagree if you don't agree with me. I just want to hear what you think. That gives them, again, the autonomy and the permission to disagree and not do it if they don't want to. Again, not pushing. So if they decide they're going to take your advice, they've asked for it, they've taken it in, and then they've actually, if they agree with it, it's come out of their mouth why they agree with it. Makes them far more likely to take it than if you just tell them the right thing to do. So give that a shot. Ask permission, provide information, and then ask for reactions afterwards. The V stands for validating, which is about telling someone that how they're feeling is okay. Because like, if you think about it, if you've ever been in an argument with your significant other and they've said something like, you're overreacting, or like, you just need to chill out, it's not such a big deal. Never have you ever been like, you know what, you're right, all my feelings are invalid, you are completely right, I have no idea what I was thinking, clearly I'm just being emotional right now. Like, never, right? Doesn't work that way. Also doesn't work that way for kids, but a lot of times as adults, we have a greater perspective and it's easy for us to dismiss how kids feel. But what that does is it undermines their self-efficacy and their trust in their own emotions. Like, to give you guys an example, my kids are younger than teenagers. I've got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And a few months ago, my 5-year-old son, there's a seat at our kitchen island that he normally sits at. And so, he's coming down to have lunch and my daughter is sitting in that seat. And this was a huge issue, like she is in my seat and he's like melting down. Now, obviously, like, this is actually like objectively not a big deal. Like, it's a chair, it's where you're eating lunch. But in his mind, it was huge because this was his routine. He had some attachment to it. There was something going on there where it really mattered to him that she was in his chair. And so the way that we got him to calm down was by validating his emotions first and saying, like, wow, this is really hard for you, this change, the fact that she's in your chair or in a chair you normally sit in. Let's talk about that for a minute. Tell me how you feel, right? Naming the emotion, talking about the emotion, validating it, and then perhaps moving on to problem solving or moving on to perspective setting goes a lot longer or a lot further rather than just saying like, oh, like, or like, oh, like, I'm sorry your high school boyfriend broke up with you. It probably wasn't going to last anyway because, you're going to change a lot when you're in college. So boo-hoo. Like that doesn't do anything, right? You've got to validate first. And empathizing goes hand in hand with validating. It's a little bit different. It's trying to show someone that you know how they feel, or that at the very least that you see them. To borrow a phrase from Brene Brown, be in the hole with them. If you haven't seen her cartoon about empathizing, just type in empathy hole, and it's a great little 3-minute cartoon. But it's about if someone's in an emotional hole, they don't just want you to throw down a ladder and tell them to come out. They want you to come down with them and be with them and see them and validate them, and then help them out of the hole. Goes a long way towards, again, coming to the top again, creating emotional safety, which is something that I think a lot of people take for granted in many of their relationships. Emotional safety is the bedrock of connection. If you don't have safety in a relationship and trust in that safety, you don't have very much else. And so if this is something that you don't have with a student you're trying to connect with, or even with your own children, just know that it might take some persistence. Don't get discouraged, just keep it up. This is a dog driving the car moment. If someone doesn't feel safe, that's discomfort. That's a dog thing. That's the dog saying, whoa, you're uncomfortable. Don't open up. Don't talk to them. You got to keep this a secret. If anyone knows about this, it's going to be really bad for you. So what we're going to do is we're just not going to tell anyone. So there's going to be that urge from that limbic part of the brain to avoid that disclosure, particularly if they've been burned before. So don't get discouraged. You have to show, not tell. Saying, it's okay, you can talk to me, means nothing if the kid doesn't actually trust, right? Saying it, that's dismissive, right? If it can come across as dismissive. You have to show them that you're trustworthy. And sometimes that takes time. And make sure, though, if you're connecting and if you are struggling, just make sure to contact parents if you do have concerns. That actually can rupture sometimes that safety. But I thought it was important to put here that there's going to be a point potentially in some relationships where you need to make sure that the parent side of the coin knows, because there's limits to what you can potentially do as a caring adult versus what you can do as a parent. And I know that's a really tough balance, and I want to acknowledge that. And at the same time, it's something that you've got to keep in mind about if you're noticing a trajectory or you're noticing an escalation, or if just something you're hearing is very concerning, that there's things that parents can do that you can't. So things that you can also do in terms of encouraging healthy coping, because when we talk again about stimulant use, for high school kids, the most prominent has to do with coping with problems and with peer pressure. Secondary, but also prominent, is trying to boost their grades. That flips again when they get to college. But that's really, those are two big things. So on the side of boosting performance, encourage them, if you have the opportunity to talk about this, to test their assumptions about stimulants. Because again, the research shows that it doesn't actually help. So like what would happen, for example, this is the better offer idea, if you're studying differently. If you tried going at this in a different angle, working with a tutor, you can also write out a pro-con list. The technical term for this is called the decisional balance, where you talk about, well, what are the pros of continuing to use stimulants versus the cons of using stimulants? And then what are the positive sides of changing your behavior? And what are the negative sides of changing your behavior? A lot of times, if you actually map this out, you'll start to notice that the balance tends to lean towards changing behavior when you actually put it out on paper. Something I like to do a lot with my patients as well when I'm doing this intervention is weight how important the pros and cons are. Because a lot of times there might be several things that might make someone want to not change and to keep doing what they're doing. But in the importance category, there might be some really important things on the changing behavior that help outweigh that and can help someone resolve their ambivalence about it, because that's ultimately what you're trying to do, is and again, this leans back into the motivational interviewing literature for those of you who are familiar with that. But if you've got a student who has some has some thoughts. They're contemplative is the technical term for it, but they're thinking about changing. They're thinking, you know, I've been misusing my prescription, or I've been buying from or taking from another kid at school. Maybe I should stop. I'm torn about it. Again, pushing them, not the best way to go. You want them to want to change for their own reasons. So highlighting what that is helps a lot. What you want to do as well is build discrepancy between their actions and their values. We call that cognitive dissonance, when you feel one way, but you do another. And so you want to try to build that dissonance, actually, because when people feel that tension, we don't like discomfort, right? That's the dog in our brain. Dog doesn't like to feel uncomfortable. So you're going to want to try to resolve that tension. And so if your values say, I don't want to be doing something illegal, I want to feel competent and stand on my own 2 feet, or I want to fit in with a group of friends who share my values, not do something that goes against my values to fit in. If you can emphasize that, you can potentially get a child to fall on the side of their values rather than try to bring their values over to match their potentially antisocial behaviors. So all that being said, it's important to know your limits as someone who's not their parent, because substance use is a web. There's a biological side to this. There's a psychological side to this. There's a social side to this. There's a number of different facets that really can lock someone into place. And so it's very easy to get over-concerned or think you can do more than you can actually do. If a child is, for example, identifying as a drug user, if they're very enmeshed with using stimulants or other drugs, if this is something all their other friends are doing, really tough to break them out of that from a non-parent, non-therapist, non-treatment program, even sometimes perspective. Like there's a lot of resetting that needs to be done, in part because the behavioral incentives are often backwards for the behavior. Like I was mentioning before, if they're having consequences and still doing the same thing, that means they're getting something profoundly important out of that for a biological, psychological, or social use. We don't know what it is necessarily unless you figure it out, but they're getting something really important. And so if that's the case, thinking that you can shift that all on your own, I guess just to be frank, probably not going to happen. You can be part of the solution, and you should be part of the solution, but there's going to need to be more than just you. And in that vein, getting the ball rolling in the right direction is a huge win. And as someone on the outside, that is the most important thing you can do, is if you can identify a problem, if you can see it happening, if you can engage the student in a dialogue so that they open up with you, they talk about it. If you can use some of these strategies to move them towards thinking, maybe I should change this behavior, and even better, get them hooked into services that can help them, like a therapist, like big brothers and big sisters. Like there's a number of things you can do, but just getting that started is a tremendous win if you are on the outside of that social ecosystem. So to sum everything up, and then I think we'll have a couple minutes before the top of the hour, but again, I'm happy to stay a little bit afterwards to help answer questions. It's exacerbated an already challenging mental health and substance use ecosystem, and we just have to be profoundly aware of that right now. It's so important that we are there for our kids. They really need us now more than ever. Teens are using stimulants for a number of reasons, but primarily erroneously for performance enhancement, and then also for recreation. Those are the two big ones, as research tells us. Stimulants are a valid treatment for ADHD, although teens who are prescribed it, which is the majority, are also the primary source for both diverting their stimulants and tend to misuse them as well. So that's a really complicated balance, and helping teens with ADHD navigate that is really important if you can help serve that purpose. So as I said, they need our support now more than ever. Things you can do: keep warning signs in mind, create emotional safety, and connect with the family if appropriate. Don't be afraid to do that if you really feel strongly that you need to, because again, you can only go so far. And if they're in danger, or if they're really slipping, or if they're heading down a very negative slope, they might actually benefit more from getting additional care than they're going to lose if there's a rupture in trust in the relationship. So that's a balance that only you can decide, but you've got to keep in mind. So with that, I'll say thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate it this afternoon. Hopefully this was useful to you, and that you took something away that you can put into action. Again, if you have questions, email me. It's right there, or visit me at my website at weinerphd.com. I also, I'm all over social media. A lot of what you see in my presentations at one point or another, I push out on my socials. So if you'd like to stay in touch there, I put lots out every week on there. I'm constantly consuming new material and putting out the stuff I think is important, so that you don't have to. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Courtney and Abby. Thanks again for having me, guys, and love to do some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Weiner. I know I learned a lot, and I am sure everybody who was in attendance today as well learned a plethora of information that they can take back to really just help support the adolescents that they are supporting in their lives. At this time, we are going to take some Q&A. It looks like we have about, if you have some time to stay after with us, please hold tight. We'll stick around until about 1:05. So it looks like we have about 5 minutes for questions. Whoever has the first question, go ahead and put that into the chat box, and we will let Dr. Aaron Weiner answer those. Ask away if you have any. If not, I know Dr. Weiner graciously shared his contact information. And so if you think of things after you jump off the call today, you are welcome to reach out to him as well.
You could also be entertained by us awkwardly staring into the camera. That's also an option for this time. Although I love doing that with the music at the beginning. You guys have great startup music, I gotta say. I was like jamming over here.
Like to set the tone of the meeting, that's for sure. It always gets people uplifting some moods and not just sitting in awkward silence, right? Ashley, I see your question here about a certificate of attendance. I will make sure that you get a certificate of attendance after the meeting concludes today. And
I just got a question. Are you seeing teens using illegal stimulants like meth? And then actually, Courtney, I got a message from Valerie saying that she sent something directly to you. So you might want to check that out. Yeah, Adele. So what we're seeing is, so for me personally, I would say, so my practice with teens, I'd say is I work with teens, but I'd say is probably only like 10 or less % at this point. So firsthand, I don't see it as much. What I can say from the national level statistics is that we don't see meth quite as much as other substances. Right now, the big ones for teens are alcohol, as always. Vaping of all sorts is huge right now with nicotine and THC. Marijuana products, including edibles and smoked marijuana, are also really huge right now. Behind that are stimulants. Behind that are opioids. And then under that are others like cocaine and methamphetamine and the like that. Again, in part because of when you think about how people progress through drug sequencing, most people don't start with meth is kind of seen, and rightfully so, as a pretty destructive drug, given what it does to like your skin and your teeth and your brain as a whole. And so that perceived risk graph, the perceived risk of meth is pretty high. So kids generally don't start there.
I will answer
Jenny
Becky's
asked,
question.
go
Oops,
ahead.
just really quickly, we will send a survey. I'm actually going to put it in the chat box as soon as we're done with Q&A. So just hold tight. It looks like there was one more question that came into the chat box as well. Any thought on how schools can improve mental health and substance use information to their students?
Wow. So there's a whole science to that, actually, which, to be perfectly frank with you, I love prevention. I do a lot of prevention work. I am not a preventionist. My training is as a psychologist. So that's more like treatment and reactionary rather than being proactive. So I'm a student in the preventionist realm. There is a tremendous amount of content out there. I'm sure Omni actually could probably hook us into a lot of that in terms of what's said about what the most effective way to do this is. And that also may differ depending on your unique environment. My hunch is that if you take a hyper-local approach to, like, say, a community or a school and think, what would the students respond to the most? Or if you're doing a parent intervention, what would the parents respond to the most in terms of both like what messaging they'd respond to, who the messenger is, whether or not like who they would think is credible. There's a lot of variables you have to think of. But yeah, I would refer you back to whoever your local prevention coalition is to find out about what might be most effective in your school. Cop-out answer, I know, but I think it's actually a very localized sort of thing.
think that's a great answer. Individualizing the services that we're providing is really important. Knowing that we're all coming from different areas, and the need is definitely very different across, depending on where we live geographically. So thank you so much for that. If anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. But at this time, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Weiner, for your time, for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know you're a busy person, to be with us here today and share all of the information that you shared with us. At this time, I am going to go ahead and put the evaluation and survey link into the chat. If you would so graciously please fill that out, you will actually have an opportunity to be put into a gift card raffle if you fill out the evaluation. So just a little incentive for you to go over and fill out that eval. It really helps us just plan and put together events in the future. I also want to say that if you're interested in learning more about who we are as the Prescription Playbook, as well as how to access some of our free and downloadable resources, including resources on stimulants, please visit us at ilhpp.org/prescription playbook. And just like Dr. Weiner, we are on all social media platforms as well. So please reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we are also on YouTube as well. And then lastly, our contact information is at the very bottom of the screen. But if you're interested in reaching out to us, you can reach out to us at rxplaybook@ilhpp.org. Thank you again, everyone, so much for your time today. And thank you again to Dr. Weiner. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.